What happened after the destruction? In 586, it was all over. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. The king was exiled. His sons were killed in front of him. The aristocracy of Jerusalem was exiled. This was a terrible catastrophe. So what happens next? We can, first of all, look at it from archaeology. Archaeology is always good. When we compare the population of, let's say, the highlands of Judah in the 7th century to the 5th century, we see really the dramatic outcome of these terrible events that took place in Jerusalem in the beginning of the 6th century. Because the population of the highlands of Judah was almost completely eradicated, decimated. And I think that we can safely speak about, in the 5th century, when life is back already, we can speak possibly about, 1/5 of the population only left in the highlands of Judah after this catastrophe of the beginning of the 6th century BC. And we are speaking after the return. We don't know exactly how many people were exiled, and it's difficult to say how many people came back. All this is a different story. We are not going to go into it in too many details. But even so, until the 5th century, the population is very limited and poor. And it takes Jerusalem and Judah about 4.5 centuries to recover from the shock. 4.5 centuries, because Jerusalem really comes back to life and becomes again a meaningful city, a strong city, a fortified city, a populated city, a large city, only starting around the mid-2nd century in Hasmonean times, mid-2nd century in late Hellenistic times. So between 586 and let's say 150 BC, you have a period of time, a meaningful period of time of about 4 or 4.5 centuries of decline. And it takes such a long time for Jerusalem and Judah to recover. Now, the next question is how to understand the biblical texts which speak about this period of time, especially the Persian period. In a way, also the early Hellenistic, but mainly the Persian period. Now, here we need to start with methodology. There is a major methodological problem here. And the problem, according to me, is as follows. You remember that we spoke about the method of reconstructing history. For the Iron Age, for instance, you are working with what? You are working with archaeology, you are working with ancient Near Eastern texts and the Bible. Now, for late monarchic times, archaeology is extremely strong, supplies a big package of finds and information. There are extra biblical texts, Assyrian mainly. And the biblical text is varied and is highly historical in its nature. Historical in the sense that they report about kings, their time, and while the text is ideological, it gives a background. We know about places, and there are lists of places, and so on and so forth, and the lists, it did belong to the 7th century BC, so you have something to work with. Here's the problem. When you come to the Persian period, the situation is really complicated because archaeology provides very limited data. The data are limited. The number, what we have in hands. Mainly negative evidence. Okay? There are no extra biblical texts on Jerusalem and Judah in the Persian period except for one single papyrus from Elephantine in Upper Egypt. There's this letter sent from Elephantine to Jerusalem, which speaks about, temple and so on, and the Pecha and the governor and so on. So there's one piece of information. That's it. Even the famous Cyrus decree, which we all speak about, is only from the Bible. There is no Cyrus decree in Akkadian documents. there is the famous cylinder of Cyrus, which speaks about the general ideology and the general attitude towards the nations in the territories taken over by the Persian Empire, Achaemenid Empire, in the 6th century BC. But it's not really, it has no mention of Yehud. This is the name, Yehud. This is the name of Judah under the Persian administration. So, in a situation like this, most scholars today reconstruct history of the Persian period according to the biblical text, which testifies that it was written in the time of the Persian Empire. So this is a classical, there is what I would call an immediate and real danger of circular argumentation here. That you do everything according to the two texts of the Bible, mainly Ezra and Nehemiah. And in my opinion, this, for me, it's a deja vu. When I started looking at Jerusalem and Judah of the Persian period, I had a feeling of a deja vu, because it was like speaking about 10th century Jerusalem, basically. It's the same thing, you know, that you have, you know, everybody, all the pond is quiet, and the temperature in the pond is about 25 degrees, and on the frog, all the frogs are very happy and satisfied because the water is warm. But there is a problem. You throw one stone into the pond, and you destroy all the tranquility of the frogs in the pond. So, I mean, in my opinion, a quiet, warm pond is bad for scientific research. It's bad for every research. When you see a pond like this, throw a stone. Whether you're right or wrong, throw a stone. Let me give you 2 examples or 3 examples why we have a problem here. First of all, the evidence for the settlement in Jerusalem. We all agree that the southwestern hill, that is to say, the Jewish quarter, Mount Zion, part of the Armenian quarter, the territory of the big Jerusalem of the 8th, 7th centuries BC was not inhabited until the 2nd century. Because there's no evidence, there's no pottery whatsoever there from the Persian and the early Hellenistic period. So we have to turn now to the city of David. In the city of David also the situation is highly problematic, because evidence for the Persian period you can find only in the central part of the ridge of the city of David, above the spring, in part of the ridge, which is about maybe 2 or 2.5 hectares in size. All the rest, there's negative evidence, not only negative evidence, but in all the other places, in the south, in the north, you have, what you get is late Hellenistic remains sitting directly on late Iron Age remains, with the Persian period missing. And I don't think that you want to argue that somebody came in the Ayyubid period and plucked the Persian period out of the ground in order to mislead future scholars, right? So we have a problem here, because if the size of the settlement is only 2 hectares, we are speaking about 400 people, 500 people, and we are speaking about 100 adult men in Jerusalem in the Persian period. And this is also not so simple, because the evidence, I mean, there's not a single building excavated in Jerusalem from the Persian period. There's not one single floor in Jerusalem from the Persian period. So in my view, there's a very strong probability that we are dealing with ephemeral activity near the spring, maybe fields that were brought from somewhere for later construction. It's not really evidence for a settlement, what you see. Now, this, when I combine this piece of evidence with what I described before, that is to say, the problematic nature of research of the Persian period, you know, with the danger of circular argumentation, then you see how complicated things are, because there is a tendency today of scholars to put much of the biblical text into the Persian period. And when I look as an archaeologist, I look at Jerusalem, I don't see the population, I don't see the kind of background for compilation of so many texts. Not to mention, specific stories like the story in Nehemiah about the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. So what's going on here? Let's take the story of the rebuilding of the walls. This story goes throughout the book of Nehemiah, first of all. But it is more specific in chapter 3. And there you have a description, a detailed description of the construction of the wall. And the description is very detailed because it gives many names of gates and towers and pieces of the wall and so on. There can be no question that they describe the long wall of Jerusalem, of the deserted long wall of Jerusalem, let's say, of late monarchic times. They are not speaking about the Temple Mount only, because the Temple Mount is small, is limited, and you have so many gates and so many towers, okay? Now, okay, so let's go to Jerusalem to look for the Persian period renovation of the city walls. There is no such evidence. There were 2 points where archaeologists tried to bring forward evidence for a piece of wall from the Persian period. As far as I can judge, this is not reliable information. This is not solid information from the point of view of dating. There is no sign, there is no evidence whatsoever, neither for reconstruction nor for renovation of the walls in the city of David, in the Jewish quarter, all this area. There's nothing at all. So what's going on here? We have a text, a very detailed one of the most detailed texts in the Hebrew Bible, Nehemiah chapter 3. And then the reality on the ground is very different. So what can we do here? How can we deal with it? There are basically 3 possibilities. One, that we are dealing with an utopian description. But this is really not a good solution because the story is so detailed and so to the ground, so much to the ground regarding the topography of Jerusalem, that they're speaking about something that they saw, something real. One can come and say, well, maybe this is a source from late monarchic times that, found its way to a compilation in the 5th century BC. This is also not a possibility. First of all, we should have expected a text in late monarchic times describing renovation, whatever, of the wall, and also the names of the towers and gates in the wall in the book of Nehemiah are completely different from the names of towers and gates in Kings, for instance. So we are not speaking about the same situation. The third possibility is to say something which may sound outrageous, but is not, in my opinion, to say that the description of the wall is a description of the construction of the Hasmonean wall in the 2nd century. Now, here we have a problem. The problem is that, it's not difficult from the point of view of the structure of the book of Nehemiah, because scholars before me, from the beginning of research, in my opinion, from Torrey in the late 19th century, noticed that chapter 3 is not part of what's called usually the Nehemiah memoir. The Nehemiah memoir is the book, but chapter 3 is different. It was entered into the middle of the Nehemiah memoir. So from the literary point of view, there's no problem. But there is a problem from another point of view. First of all, Nehemiah as a builder is mentioned in Ben Sira. And Ben Sira, an external text to the Bible, is dated usually in the beginning of the 2nd century, before the Hasmoneans. So if Ben Sira knows about construction of the wall, then it cannot be said that the wall is from the mid-2nd century, after his time. Secondly, the story of the wall goes through the book of Nehemiah. So if we say that the wall was constructed in Hasmonean times, it makes the entire book of Nehemiah a Hasmonean compilation, which is a little bit difficult. It's not easy to say. So I think that the solution should be, and I think that the idea of a mound on the mount, that is to say that the major mound of Jerusalem is under the Temple Mount, may solve this problem, because there could have been a memory, there could have been a tradition, there could have been a writing regarding renovation of the walls that is to say the walls around the Temple Mount. Okay, the core of the settlement of Jerusalem. And only chapter 3 is an insertion of a text from the Hasmonean period. This resolves this problem. And it also fits, the whole story of Nehemiah. It's really also interesting to mention that Nehemiah was an important figure for the Hasmoneans. And he is mentioned in a very interesting way in the book of Maccabees. Okay? And Nehemiah was a good example and a good model for the Hasmoneans for several reasons. First of all, he was, a pious man. He was a builder. He was a leader. He was a secular leader, if you wish. And he was a man of great pity and so on and so forth. But there's more than that. Nehemiah was not from the Davidic line. And Nehemiah was not a Zadokite. So this was really wonderful as a model for the Hasmoneans, who had a problem because they were not of the Davidic line. So they, their nostalgia goes to Nehemiah because Nehemiah is the model. He is not a Davidite and he is not a Zadokite. So he is good for them, as a model for leadership and pity. Another example is the list of returnees in Ezra and Nehemiah. When you look at the list of returnees in Ezra and Nehemiah, you can see that out of the 17 places which can be identified in the list of returnees, 5 were not inhabited at all in the Persian period. And 6 have evidence for very ephemeral activity. So what's going on here? Is it possible that this list really represents the Persian period? Again, you have a problem. Okay, the same kind of a problem. I don't want to go into the list of returnees because this is a very complicated story. Also in the list of returnees, there is a dichotomy between the archaeological evidence and the biblical evidence, in the sense that the distribution of the seal impressions inscribed with the name of the province Yehud, seal impressions which belong to the 5th century or the 4th century BC, their distribution does not fit what we see. By the way, neither in Nehemiah 3 nor in the list of returnees. So again, we have here, I told you, it's a deja vu. You have, again, a situation of uneasy relationship between archaeology and the text. I think that if we summarize this situation in the Persian period, what we see, and this is the most important, what we see, we have 2 lessons from this. The first lesson for the Persian period is that you cannot really reconstruct history only with the biblical text, assuming that Ezra and Nehemiah are 5th century or 4th century compilations. Because they may have layers, the same way that we spoke about Genesis, or the same way we speak about the Deuteronomistic history, or the same way we spoke about the tradition of Solomon. There are layers there. There are layers also in Ezra and Nehemiah. By the way, biblical scholars noticed that and even went as far as suggesting that the latest layers may even date to the Hasmonean period. But this is a very important lesson. Be careful if you don't have support of archaeology or ancient Near Eastern texts, or if you do have support of archaeology and archaeology contradicts what you read in the text, be careful, take a step back and think about it very carefully. This is the first lesson. Second lesson is, I think that we need to be very careful in putting all the weight of compilation of biblical texts on the Persian period. I do not, I'm not against the possibility of compilation of biblical texts in the Persian period. What I'm saying is that we need to be careful because there is much scribal activity, I think, in late monarchic times, and there is no less scribal activity in another phase in the Hasmonean period, and the low tide in settlement and population may be also a low tide in other activities, including scribal activity in Jerusalem and Judah. And finally, we see the Persian period and the early Hellenistic period as another example for the interesting nature of the history of Jerusalem, with the short periods of extremely interesting and prosperity, economic, political even, if you wish, demographic, and long periods of decline because of the nature of Jerusalem and Judah on the margin of the Levant and the great empires of the time.